Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. The oft-repeated phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, might have been coined specifically for Nelson Mandela. Gone are the days when Tory students distributed posters saying, "Hang Nelson Mandela." Now David Cameron and other world leaders rush to add their voices to those praising the life of the man credited with leading the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa. Mandela was an activist from the 1950s on. He was tried as a terrorist and imprisoned for 27 years on the notorious Robben Island. 4 years after his long walk to freedom in 1990, he was elected as the first president of the post-apartheid era. His reputation as a man of peace and reconciliation was already well established, and his likeness instantly recognisable around the world. Today, South Africa is held up as a model of progress and reconciliation. But how true is that picture? Millions remain in poverty, and the neoliberal economic model is as entrenched as ever. So what will Mandela's legacy be in a country where 60% of the population is too young to remember those great struggles of the 50s and the 60s? Joining me to discuss the issues are James Snyder, the editor of the Think Africa Press, Gertrude Kitongo, former African strategist for the BBC Johannesburg and currently a student at SOAS, Fouad Nadi, director of the Radical Middle Way, and on Skype we're joined by Luwezi Kinshasa, Secretary General of the African Socialist International, and on the phone by Tiseke Kizimbala, who is the Africa Advocacy Director of Human Rights Watch. But first of all, let's take a look at this report.
Apartheid hero Nelson Mandela died peacefully at home at the age of 95 on Thursday, after months fighting a lung infection. His nation and the world plunged into mourning for a man revered as a moral giant.
Our beloved Nelson Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed.
He achieved more than could be expected of any man. And today he's gone home. And we've lost one of the most influential, courageous, and profoundly good human beings that any of us will share time with on this earth. He no longer belongs to us. He belongs to the ages. Through his fierce dignity and unbending will to sacrifice his own freedom for the freedom of others, Madiba transformed South Africa and moved all of us.
He lived this extraordinary life, a belief in this simple principle of fighting discrimination, this extraordinary struggle of all those years in prison, then the immense triumph against adversity and all he achieved for his country and to inspire people around the world. And then throughout all of this extraordinary generosity and sense of forgiveness that he had for those who had done him so much harm. And that was the real privilege of meeting him.
There are some persons that we will never like to know that they have disappeared. Nelson Mandela was one of those persons, a great man that left his mark, not only in his native South Africa, not only in Africa, but all over the world.
Madiba was a beloved figure in India. We felt deeply honored that after his release from prison, India was one of the first countries he visited in 1990. He was awarded the Bharat Ratna, the highest honor that India can bestow, because we loved him and revered him. Because, like the Mahatma who had inspired him, he was a leader who belonged to all humanity.
C'est un homme qui frappé d'abord par son.
This man would first strike you with his physical aspect. He was a mix of authority and humanity, and his voice too. When you think about it, there are few people in history whose silhouette embodies an idea. I was thinking about it this morning. Gandhi, non-violence. Einstein, science. De Gaulle, independence. And there will be Mandela, fight against racism and national reconciliation.
Like millions of other people all over the world, I also am mourning the death of Nelson Mandela. My thoughts are with his wife and family, and with all South Africans who honour Nelson Mandela as the father of their finally free nation. Nelson Mandela was a wonderful man, He was wise, warm-hearted and humorous, as I was able to experience during my visit, which is still close to me and one of my most treasured memories of my work in politics.
A determined leader. I had a few occasions met him. I really admire. Certainly, I'm one of the admirers. So therefore, at this moment, firstly, very sad.
It's really a very big shock for us. I compare him to a big baobab, an Arbor A palabras, a great tree under which everyone takes shelter. In the end, Mandela was on the baobab under which we all took shelter. And when this baobab falls, we are naked.
Throughout his life, Mandela fought for freedom and equality in his country, and for that, he ended up serving 27 years in prison. He was among the first to advocate armed resistance to apartheid in 1960, but was quick to preach reconciliation and forgiveness when the white minority began easing its grip on power 30 years later.
I have spoken about freedom in my lifetime. Your struggle, your commitment, and your discipline has released me to stand before you today.
In 1993, Mandela was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and in 1994, he was elected president in landmark all-race elections after helping to steer the racially divided country towards reconciliation and away from civil war. Acclaimed by all sides in society in South Africa and recognized as the undoubted elder statesman and moral authority of Africa, Mandela will always enjoy international affection, admiration and prestige.
Okay, well, let's start the discussion. Let's have a look at this, because there's something slightly odd going on here, isn't there? Because there are those who fought apartheid alongside Mandela in South Africa, internationally, praising Mandela. And there are those who fought against the abolition of apartheid, or their predecessors did, who are also praising him. So do you think it's the case that the people who were against apartheid are praising him because of what he did, helped abolish apartheid, and those that are praising him who were in favour of apartheid at the time are praising him for what he didn't do? He didn't go farther, didn't challenge the basis of capitalism, didn't change enough in South Africa. Do you think that's what's happening?
I think that's probably both things. I think on the first side, I think that when one side does win, the previous opponents can then try to take them into their narrative and try to strengthen their kind of ideological firmament with the memory of something who was a previous opponent. You see the same thing with Martin Luther King and civil rights in the US. And yes, there was, I think, also with the he didn't go further, because there's always been this fear. Lots of opponents of the ANC said, well, when Mandela dies or when Mandela leaves power, then you'll suddenly see the real face that they were so scared of, the kind of more radical transformation of society. And I think they're praising him partially for not doing that, and perhaps partially a little bit in relief that that didn't happen.
Gertrude, do you think, I mean, what happened is that Mandela fought, he organised, he won, and then he forgave. Do you think that the people who are praising the forgiveness side of it understand the struggle that was necessary in order to get to the point where you could forgive?
I think so. You know, there was so much unrest in the country, and once Mandela got to the point where he forgave, everybody who looked up to him thought, because he did it, we can do it too, and can move on from this phase. And because of that, you see a lot of change in South Africa, a lot of inclusive society. You see a lot of, well, actually the aspect of Ubuntu, where even though you're white or black, they still see you as one of them. And it's all bracketed under the Mandela concept, and that's what I see as well.
Right.
It's a fascinating. I can't think of any similar development actually in our contemporary times. The thing is, does the story of Nelson Mandela end with his death, or is the beginning of the story? Because here now, after all the euphoria has died about all the leaders and stuff, the reality check is going to be the South Africa that he has left behind and the legacy that he's left behind. I think they are worlds apart. How long will his charisma, his, powerful message literally continue to pacify what has turned out to be a real disaster? South Africa today, if you look at the statistics, the black person is much, much worse off actually than during apartheid. I come from Kenya, and what has happened was the release of Mandela must have sort of stopped apartheid in South Africa, but what it did really is unleashed economic apartheid for the rest of the southern region of Africa. Because now we got these South African companies coming and dominating the whole of the country. So imprisoned or putting into effect the exploitation of resources, and people now not very happy about South African, because the South Africa they meet is not the ANC, the freedom fighters, the black activists, but is this corporate white companies which are exploitative about the mines, whether you talk about them in Tanzania or Kenya or in Malawi and things like that. So it's fascinating, but don't let us take away from the fact. What I think needs to be put into perspective is we are celebrating one person, an amazing human being, who incidentally is an amazing part of history again. And it's strange. For me, I don't find the Mandela story as difficult to digest as the one of Jomo Kenyatta. People forget that in Kenya we went through this Mau Mau rebellion, which was a very violent repression. And it is Kenyatta, with due respect, that we should give him credit, that he says we should forgive but not forget. And I think the forgiving of the Mau Mau in Kenya was much more of a higher level than in the South African case. But we did not have apartheid.
Okay. Louise, let me bring you in. You're in South Africa. I mean, sorry. You were saying that we were saying here in the studio that there's a kind of dual legacy here, an enormous achievement in terms of overthrowing apartheid, but perhaps some of the previous opponents of the ANC relieved that things didn't go further, and that was a debate inside the movement, certainly in the 1980s, wasn't it?
Well, from our perspective, as an African internationalist, one thing is clear is that it's a myth, to say that people are free in South Africa. We don't see such a thing as freedom in South Africa, because freedom has to be based on a land question. That's one aspect of it, and the land still remains in the hands of the white settlers. So there is no freedom there. What Mandela has done is to compromise the struggle of Africans in South Africa. He has been built as a world figure for years through the liberal press, throughout Europe, throughout North America. The ANC got support, the African National Congress got support from imperialist liberals, also from the Soviet Union, who recognize ANC as a legitimate organization in South Africa. So they build Mandela as a myth, because where have you seen anyone being free by compromising, by putting on the same equal footing the oppressed and the oppressors? That's what the Truth and the Reconciliation Committee is. Those who committed crime against African people are put on the same level as those who had the right to defend themselves, to fight for freedom on the same equal footing. You never seen anything like that before. And there is a link between Nelson Mandela and Jomo Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta was seen as the representative of the Mau Mau. He wasn't. He was Dedan Kimathi, and people don't talk about Dedan Kimathi. And the state of Kenya was handed over to Jomo Kenyatta, just like in South Africa. No one's talking about Steve Biko or Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, but we're talking about Nelson Mandela. When we know the crisis that allowed the ANC to come to power was initiated by Steve Biko and also Mangaliso Sabukwe. So the passing of Nelson Mandela is a time really to draw the right conclusions about
South Africa. Let me bring Tasike in on the conversation now. Where do you stand on this? I mean, I don't think anybody's going to deny the enormous achievement of bringing down such a brutal system as apartheid, but should that struggle have gone further? Could it have gone further? This is what many people in COSATU and the black-led unions in the 80s said.
Yes, I mean, certainly. I mean, there's always going to be people who express their frustration at the fact that Mandela effectively allowed whites to maintain their economically privileged positions, which actually helped further entrench the inequality that we see today in South Africa. But at the same time, what we need to realize is that this was a country that was on the brink of anarchy. It was a country that was about to descend into bloodshed and chaos. And the unique thing that Mandela actually did was to attempt to bind this nation together and to bring these two disparate races together and form a nation. And I think that is the uniqueness of what he did. And also at the same time, it's about his very principled and dignified leadership, which a lot of people are talking about right now. And that's why we see everyone coming to the fore. His enemies at the time during the apartheid era, those who termed him as a terrorist, and those who said he was a freedom fighter, coming together and recognizing that uniqueness. Because I believe that without those compromises that he made, we won't see the freedoms that we see in South Africa today. Yes, certainly there's huge economic inequalities and huge challenges, but we should also look at those who followed after him and what they've done to try and continue his legacy. Let's not forget he was only in power for 5 years.
Okay, James, do you find it disconcerting that there is this narrative which seems to suggest that apartheid fell because of the reconciliation process that came after it, not that it fell by an incredibly long, difficult struggle involving a great deal of violence, actually, and not just and not even mainly perhaps of the kind that the armed wing of the ANC was engaged in, but by the state, involved in the township struggles, by the unions and so forth. It's a rather disconcerting glossing over the real process there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but I think you see anything, lots of things like this, when any kind of complex historical event takes place, the kind of reduced, easy narrative takes over. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, apartheid was it was a negotiated ending, and it didn't end in those last 4 years, which were also incredibly violent between 1990 and 1994. Labour organising, as you say, students, townships, and also internationally to try to put pressure on South African businesses was incredibly important. And we do have to remember that overthrowing apartheid involved two things which are kind of left out. One, as you say, yes, very much struggle, which is glossed over sometimes. And also, secondly, the fact that apartheid was not only, but in many ways, an economic system. And it was made unprofitable by on-the-ground activism and international activism, and that it was the more liberal end of the ruling economic class that had started to initiate some of the transition.
Anglo-American.
Precisely. And so when we are looking at what came out of the transition, we have to remember that it wasn't as if the anti-apartheid forces just won. They came to an agreement with the dominant economic forces. And I think that, yes, that involves a huge amount of compromise, and so people can be angry, but it has to be seen in the context that if there wasn't compromise, there could have been a coup, there could have been civil war, and things could have got extremely violent.
Obviously, the whole process, the decades-long process of struggle was necessary. But I think it seemed to many of us living through it that in the 1980s there was a critical moment where black organised labour appeared on the scene, slammed into the people in Anglo-American, the sort of liberal wing of the, and that was a kind of a tipping point. Is that how you see it?
Well, I see it in a process, and I see it a lot as more a negotiation within the African society and negotiation within white society as well, to just come to a state of peace, especially because I see a lot of white people, even as I look at apartheid, who are against it, and they really wanted it to end, and they saw the animosity that it was causing in the economy, they saw the animosity that it was causing in the country, and they wanted it to end. So that's how I see it. I see when I look at Mandela himself and the negotiation that he did at the end, which was apparently a secret negotiation that he made, and his counterparts, his comrades, were quite against it, but eventually had to allow it because of what would have happened if he had not, and that's how I see it.
If you had to identify an absolutely critical tipping point where the apartheid regime was no longer sustainable, where would you put it?
It's very strange. A week before 9/11, I was in South Africa attending the World Conference Against Racism. And I just can't get it out of my mind because on 2 days before 9/11, we passed a resolution which equated apartheid to Zionism. And that was categorical. If it wasn't for the bombing in New York, I don't know where we would be about that bigger debate. And here I can draw the parallel about the situation is what happened in South Africa about apartheid. That is why it's not happening in Palestine about Zionism. If James's thing is right, it's because people are afraid about what's going to happen next. I think in the South African case, the new Mandela was a safe pair of hands they could get who could make that transition. I am divided about the situation what Gertrude is talking about internal conflict, because we've seen it in other places.
I'm just going to have to stop you there because we're coming to the break, but I thank you for introducing the issue of the next half of the programme, which is going to be exactly on the comparisons between the situation faced by the Palestinians and the situation under apartheid. So do rejoin us for the second part of analysis where we'll be exploring exactly that question.